With Mass Effect Andromeda on the horizon, I thought it would be interesting to look at the ending to my favorite BioWare game and most consistent contestant for my favorite game of all time, Dragon Age 2. The ending to Dragon Age 2 is probably the most controversial in the BioWare fandom. Well, at least a part of it that gives a shit about Dragon Age. Anders, one of your companions and the only true healer on the team, turns out to have put a magical time bomb in the Chandra, and suddenly the side plot about Mage temple relations, which you may not have thought that much about till then, is thrust into the foreground. No more ignoring it. Here it is. I love this moment. Throughout the game we've been seeing Kirkwall's population come to a boiling point on several issues, but none has brought so much tension to the game's plot as the question of mages. Kirkwall, as we know, is also one of the most brutal circles in the Three Marches. As the plot heavily alludes to, the old slave name, the City of Change, still holds very true to present-day Phyllis. You as a player character is also bound to the mage issue even if you don't play as a mage. Your sister Bethany was a mage, of course, and you're the child of a runaway apostate and a local noblewoman. You're everything a maker-fearing noble would hate, and here you are, for at least 6 years the center of attention and the eye of the hurricane that is Kirkwall and her politics. As an interesting aside, the name Kirkwall is taken from a Scottish city of the same name. The name is taken from the Norse Kirkjuvaga, which roughly means Church Bay. With the Chantry playing such a large role in the plot of Dragon Age 2, the stolen town name actually makes a lot of sense. Now the Druffalo in the potmaker's shop is of course the question of Anders and whether his actions were justified. You, as a player, is given the option to execute him for his actions, and everyone around you, including Anders himself, actually expects you to do that. In fact, if you have the DLC installed, one of your companions demand that you do so, lest the city will be hit with even more conflict. Honestly though, at that point in the game, the prospect of Kirkwall being hit with even more conflict isn't that big of a threat. Now, in my opinion, the explosion at the Chantry of Kirkwall was a logical outcome to a tension that had been building for years and years on end. I am of the opinion that if Anders had not ended up exploding the Chantry, Meredith would have done something very similar. Meredith is, as we know, as a spectator, influenced by the Red Lyrium, of course. We don't know that at the point where we make the decision about whether or not to execute Anders, and that is an interesting decision from the writer's standpoint. Up till then, you've really only been encountering the Red Lyrium in the Bartrand submissions, and even then, there's no real allusion to who has the Red Lyrium after that. As far as you know, Orsino may as well have it, or Anders. I think I'm not only speaking for myself when I say that a lot of people will probably have made different decisions based on the knowledge that Meredith was under the effect of Red Lyrium. When you decide to kill Anders, Meredith seems a little over the edge, but not influenced by any outside sources. And then of course, whether or not you side with the Templars, she freaks out and turns into a Red Lyrium monster to give us the big final battle all RPG games must have. Honestly, were it up to me, the game had probably stopped at the Chandra explosion, giving us a big cliffhanger, maybe even leaving it vague who were behind it. The insanity that comes from Red Lyrium has changed since the days of Dragon Age 2, of course. In Dragon Age Inquisition, it instead just powered you up and maybe turned you into a giant monster. But in Dragon Age 2, it simply made you very paranoid and made you justify most hideous actions in whatever way possible. It sort of created your own sort of logic about, oh, I have to kill these people because otherwise they might work against my goal. Bartrand was a very greedy dwarf, so the lyrium just enhanced that feeling and it made him betray others for his sense of greed. It gave him a Gollum-like feeling towards the Red Lyrium. Meredith is affected kind of differently by the Red Lyrium. She just becomes very paranoid and very angry. She thinks everyone is out to get her. I don't think it's much of a jump of logic that had she been running around with that lyrium for long enough, she probably would have killed Mother Elfina herself, justifying it as the Maker's will. When the mages then revolted, understandably, against Meredith, she would have called for a right of annulment, and as far as on paper goes, nothing wrong was done, but Meredith would continue to be even more paranoid and even more angry, eventually turning into the red monster you eventually encounter anyway at the ending of the game. So, as far as I'm concerned, whether or not Anders had blown up the chantry, I don't think the outcome would have been much different. The mage revolt would have come either way, and Elfina probably would have been dead either way. It just would have happened maybe a month later. Everything else would have been exactly as it ended up being, except Anders probably wouldn't have taken the blame for the entire thing. It says a lot about Meredith that the Red Lyrium just made her even more committed to her cause. Like, as bad as what she does is, it is interesting that her willpower is still strong enough to not change her interest from the circle issue to just pure murder. Meredith, as bad as she is, probably held off on a lot of her actions for at least 2-3 years, which is more than can be said for Bertrand, who apparently went completely nuts once he got the Red Lyrium in hand. Honestly, the inconsistency of the effects of Red Lyrium remains one of Dragon Age's weak points, not just from the perspective of the retcon in Inquisition, but also from the game where it was actually introduced. The effects on Meredith were slow and crawled over several years, while the effect on Bertrand seems to have been immediate and made him make very big decisions in a matter of a few seconds. Anders, of course, is not completely unaffected by outside influence. As we know, he is bonded with a spirit of justice, which has turned into a spirit of vengeance because of Anders' overall feeling of injustice from the chantry and the circle. Anders formerly being a very religious person, the feeling of betrayal that the circle instills in him has sort of turned the spirit of justice into a spirit of vengeance. And whether the spirit of vengeance is good or evil is sort of left up to interpretation. Even the writers seem kind of, oh, here's some good things he does, here's some bad things he does. It's more like a magical Ninetales demon freakout that he sometimes has. The post-ending of Dragon Age 2 is probably the weakest point of the game, because once the chantry explosion happened, that was the big climax. That was where the big explosion happened. After that, you're just sort of given a choice and given 2 boss battles, and then the game ends on a note about, oh, we have to find the champion, and oh, we have to find the hero of Ferelden. Let's go off to make you very disappointed in who the hero of Dragon Age Inquisition turns out to be. This is not meant to be a criticism of Dragon Age Inquisition, but it is very clear that the game has changed even from the get-go about what Inquisition was supposed to be about. If we're talking about the ending anyway, and we're talking about the 2 sides anyway, let's talk about Orsino and just talk about how fucking superfluous Orsino actually is. I mean, it makes sense that there would be a mage elder leader from the actual circle mages, but as far as him taking part in the story, he doesn't really do much. He's just sort of neutered, and it's alluded to that he has just as many shady decisions behind him as Meredith. But of course, in Orsino's case, it's left a little bit more up to guesswork. Meredith is very much, on the surface, a very mean character. Orsino, of course, seems more charismatic. You're just sort of supposed to understand that he was behind the whole murder of Hawke's mother. As far as the anti-mage or pro-circle side goes, we have Meredith in the villain department, and then we have Fenris, who at most just seems very angry with Tevinter mages. He doesn't seem that concerned with normal mages, especially not considered that for most of the game he runs around with normal mages that he for some reason decides not to report. Even you as a main character can play as a mage, and that's probably to the game's fault, even though apparently canonically Hawk is a mage, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense when you consider just how hostile Fenris is supposed to be about mages. It's sort of like a little bit of his personality is cut off just to justify why he wouldn't report you and the other mages. Of course, it could also be justified by the fact that Fenris is a runaway piece of property. He probably doesn't want to call a lot of attention to himself, but that's sort of a flimsy excuse and mostly gameplay justification in my opinion. I was talking to my friend Clumsy while writing this, and she actually told me that she thinks Anders probably hates Fenris more than Fenris hates mages. So the explanation is that Fenris just stands up for his friends. In fact, she pointed out that Fenris tells Sebastian to take it up with Hawk when Sebastian threatens to turn in both Meryl and Anders to the Templars. The ending to Dragon Age 2 is important to me not just because of how interesting the discussion surrounding it is, but also because of how much autonomy it gives to the companion characters. In none of these RPGs and just games in general, your companions are just sort of accessories that walks around with you and that maybe has opinions of their own but never really act upon them. In Dragon Age 2, that is underlined to the nth degree, both in the ending of the final act but also very much in the ending of Act 2 with Isabella. You're not allowed to not have a real opinion on the fantasy politics in Dragon Age. It's always put there with you and it actually matters. You're not just playing a video game and clicking the monsters at the right spots. You're actually living in a fantasy universe, and while Dragon Age 2 is not the most engaging game sometimes, it certainly does a very good job of trying to engage you in the social issues and the social politics of this world they've created. Something you don't really see in Origins, Awakening, or Inquisition, even though Inquisition has you interact with high society and even has you judge a lot of political things. That's also why when I hear people telling their friends to skip Dragon Age 2 and go directly to Inquisition, I get kind of upset because a lot of the issues that exist in the Dragon Age universe doesn't really mean much if you only play Origins and Inquisition. They're mostly expanded upon in Dragon Age 2. Dragon Age 2 is the exposition dump in the middle of the book. Dragon Age 2, when it came out, was the game that turned me on to discussing politics in video games and discussing video games as more than just pieces of entertainment. Sure, there had been artistic video games before that and have been a lot more artistic games since then, but to me, Dragon Age was the first game that was in your face about it. Wasn't scared to take actions away from you and give your companions real autonomy in a fantasy game. Compare this to the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. After a lengthy intro of just listening to a guy yell about one of your fellow prisoners and vague details about a king dying, you're expected to decide between the game's two main factions in order to enter the game's tutorial. Afterwards, this choice has little meaning as you can decide between the two armies as you please and then you're not affected by the politics or ongoing war of Skyrim at all. A civil war is supposed to be going on and for most of the game your most consistent peril is dragons and mountain bandits. No angry soldiers or stray arrows. No armies clashing over any of the towns you enter. The only people really concerned with the war are the Jarls, as most NPCs just can only worry about their own problems. Elder Scrolls was never about any of those things, of course. Main quest never being the big priority with most casual Bethesda fans, so they have to kind of work around the majority of their audience. That makes sense. But comparing it to Dragon Age 2, it's very much a pity that they didn't stray from the feel of Oblivion at all by actually including the game's narrative in the game world. Instead, it's just sort of offhandedly mentioned that there's a war going on outside of a few specific NPCs. Specifically the four guilds, the Companions, Winterhold College, the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild don't even bring up the war as a concern at all. You'd think a civil war would put the Brotherhood to work, but it apparently doesn't. But while sticking to the story and the politics for so long is one of Dragon Age 2's strong points, it's also one of its weakest points. The problem with adhering so much to the politics of the in-game world is that Dragon Age 2 as a story gets a little bit confused at what big social issue it should focus on. And again, while Orsino and Meredith is very much brought to the forefront and end up being the final boss of the game, you're actually presented with several issues throughout the game. And, as such, some issues and some plot threads feel very much open-ended and not really concluded satisfyingly. To elaborate, by the time Act 3 starts, you've already kind of played a big climax as well. As I mentioned, the Chantry explosion feels like a big climax, but so does the fight against the Arishok. In fact, of most of the marketing for the game, the Arishok was put forefront, and even though you see Meredith and Orsino on the title screen every time you boot the game, the Arishok definitely feels like he has a more lasting and bigger presence in the game for most of it until you enter Act 3. It doesn't help either, of course, that your first real meeting with Meredith and Orsino is in Act 2 at the fight against the Arishok. Had Dragon Age 2 been adapted into a movie or a TV show, Arishok would have been a season finale or a big ending of a movie. Your meeting with Orsino and Meredith would then be a taste of what's to come in the next chapter of the story. Which it of course also is in the game, but because the scene with the marketplace happens immediately in Act 3, you don't really have a lot of time to see this tension building. Either Orsino and Meredith should have been introduced much sooner, or Act 3 should have been its own game or entity. Of course, a lot of this can be explained with time restraints. The team at BioWare was divided into working on Awakening at the same time they were working on Dragon Age 2, because the people at EA, the big bosses at EA, didn't think Origins would do very well. Had Dragon Age 2 had the time it needed to be made, you would probably have seen much more character development and the tension building a lot more before the big scene in the marketplace at the beginning of Act 3. The beginning of Act 3 would probably have taken place 3 hours later in the game, maybe even 4 or 5 hours later in the game. Gushing about what could have been is all well and good, but as it stands, Dragon Age 2 is unfortunately a story that is crushed under the weight of having too much to say. Dragon Age 2 really wanted to get you involved in the Dragon Age universe more than you had been in Origins, and prove that the Dragon Age universe just wasn't another fantasy universe with a lot of the same flimsy problems that the other fantasy universes have. Dragon Age 2 wanted to give personality to the problems that the universe faces and give you a normal character that didn't have some sort of magical outsider's perspective on what was happened. You weren't a chosen one, you weren't a Grey Warden, you weren't ripped out of your normal lifestyle. Hawk is an opportunist, and every problem they're thrust into, they're sort of thrust into on their own accord. The obvious caveat of that statement is, of course, that yes, Hawk did flee their former lifestyle, but they did also live a normal lifestyle in Kirkwall for a full year before going on adventures with Varric and getting thrust into all the problems and turning attention to themselves. Something either form of Hawk actually shouldn't want, which Carver politely points out, and Bethany also very politely points out several times in Act 1. In fact, the more times I play Dragon Age 2, the more I sympathize with Seneschal Brian and all the shit he has to deal with because of all the shit you stir. Love or hate it, but Hawk is just a professional shit stirrer, which makes them a perfect fit for being the champion of shit stir central Kirkwall. In the end, to me, Dragon Age 2 is a game about seeing the world around you change and getting into tensions and what you should do as an actor in this world. But it's also a game about remembering that your fellow humans aren't just drones, and they will sometimes have opinions regardless of you. The autonomy of Anders and the autonomy of Isabella is what makes Dragon Age 2 stand out from both the rest of the Dragon Age series, but also from a lot of other games in the genre. This video has been sort of a Moby Dick of mine for several years. I've been wanting to write this video even before I started Let's Playing, and even now I have trouble coming to a conclusion here at the end. I hope in the future when your friends ask you about Dragon Age that you will recommend them to play all the games, not just the most popular ones. Dragon Age 2 deserves its place in the series, and it has given the series a lot of good things. While a lot of those things were quickly notched aside in Inquisition, I think Dragon Age 2 is still the game that gives you the most context for the universe from a different perspective than a ruler or a soldier. Dragon Age 2 is the game that gives you the perspective of the citizen, and that's why it's so important. A thank you goes out to Clumsy Chicken for comparing notes with me and discussing this ending in so many details for all these years. And a thank you goes to you guys for watching this video and putting up with me for this long. I'll see you guys in another video. Bye!